Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and thank you for joining me here in Season 4 of the Logical Christian Podcast. I'm your Logical Christian, Dan Irwin. If you're here for what to think, you've come to the wrong place. I'll give you my view on current events, politics, science, religion, and whatever else from a logical, most importantly, a Christian worldview. But this is more about how to think. Don't just accept what you're told, ask questions and dig deep. Links for the material are in the notes if you'd like to follow along, and with that, let's go be logical Christians. A question I think I've asked more times than I ever thought possible since I became a parent is, what are you doing? And it can be asked in a few ways. Innocently just inquiring as to their current activity. What are you doing? Or it could be asked in more of a panicked way as you need whatever's going on to kind of just stop immediately. What are you doing? I've also asked that question of myself in various ways in various situations, asking myself for others for clarity. What am I doing again? Or in frustration, what am I doing? Or it can be asked more Bidenly, usually accompanied by other questions like, where am I? What am I doing? It's a good question, generally speaking, wouldn't you agree? I feel like it should be asked more often by more people about more things. Seems like these days we just kind of do or say things without asking what we're doing, or for that matter, why we're doing it. On today's episode, first we're going to really, and I mean really, screw things up, then we'll let God know what He's actually doing, and finally we'll purge the evil from the camp. So, take your favorite pain reliever, you're going to need it, and then you'll probably want to stay away from any open fields or tall trees. Chances of lightning are pretty high, and finally grab your sack of high-quality throwing stones, because what we're actually doing here is, here we go. Principal Skinner called a school assembly to tell the students who among them are having problems. He announced that the first academic alert was Wiggum, Ralph. Ralph jumped up and shouted, I won, and jumped on stage, walking to Principal Skinner at the podium. Principal Skinner said that, no, it meant he was failing English, to which Ralph replied, me fail English? That's impossible. But no, Ralph, it's not impossible. In fact, although every single year we hear over and over about how the current year is the hottest year ever on record, we rarely hear about how every year is the dumbest year on record. The articles are out there, the stories are mentioned, but they're just not that important. Not as important as 1.5 degrees Celsius, apparently, which just seems impossible to me. We know that the debacle of the handling of school with regard to COVID, especially the evil teachers' unions and the little demon who heads up the American Federation of Teachers, Randy Weingarten, wanting to keep kids out of school and on screens indefinitely, well, that didn't help. That's a given. But prior to that, and since then, the failure that is the American public school system is fully displayed just year after year. On October 24th, 2022, a big report came out that was headlined as 2 decades of progress nearly gone. National math, reading scores hit historic lows. They blamed the pandemic, and in part they're correct, but that year or two didn't decimate our education system or our test scores. That said, when the testing was done, it resulted in the biggest drop in math performance in 4th and 8th grade since testing began in 1990. Reading scores also dropped all the way back to 1990 levels, and about 1/3 of the students in both 4th and 8th grade couldn't read at the lowest level of the test. Overall, broken down by ethnicity, because, everything is broken down by ethnicity, we find that for both grades, for both subjects, black students scored the worst, followed closely by Native Americans, then Hispanic, whites, and finally Asian and Pacific Islanders. When looking at math for both grades, the states with the highest percentage of students who couldn't even meet the basic lowest level of competency were New Mexico and West Virginia. But really all the states across the South, except for Texas, did poorly, as did the West Coast, except for Washington. The Midwest and the northern states seemed to fare the best, and for nearly every state there was a massive drop-off in skills from 4th to 8th grade. The only states that seemed to come out okay over both grades were Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, South Dakota, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Wisconsin. Looking at the same analysis for reading is somewhat opposite, with reading scores actually generally increasing from 4th to 8th grade, but still New Mexico was the worst of the worst, with the entire country, not counting Wyoming, Florida, and Massachusetts, doing poorly in the 4th grade, and essentially the southern United States doing poorly in the 8th grade, while the northern states, save for a couple, stepped it up in the 8th grade. No matter how you look at it, the education system in the United States doesn't seem, good at what it's supposed to be doing. More recently, the National Center for Education Statistics released their Trends in International Mathematics and Science study, test results, which shows again that the U.S. students are falling behind the rest of the world, and this can't be blamed on COVID, at least not to the same extent, because the pandemic was global, with many of the same measures taken across various nations. In an article found on abcnews.com, headline, U.S. students' declining math scores are sobering, experts say. Now, we discovered that, as with the previously mentioned test, 4th graders were found to have dropped 18 points in math testing from 2019 to 2023, while 8th graders dropped 27 points. They also mentioned that boys were better at math than girls, which, that's because boys are generally built more for math than girls. That's not sexist. It's just, generally speaking, it is, right? But no, it's sexist. It's a gender gap that needs closing, is what we're told. And I have to ask, does it? Because no, it doesn't, actually. We don't need to close that. We don't need to have boys and girls equal in everything simply because boys aren't girls and girls aren't boys, and that's the way it's supposed to be. Now, as compared to other countries, the U.S. is behind those in Asian countries like Singapore and, shocker of all shockers, Japan. And is that racist? No, again, it is just kind of what it is, right? As well as a few European countries like the UK and Poland. The experts, of course, say that the students in the U.S. were locked down or locked out of schools longer than other countries during the pandemic, and that makes me angry if that's actually true. Not gonna lie. The heck are we doing, right? We're the United States, and we can't get our students back in the schools? And no, it's not can't, really, is it? It's wouldn't. We wouldn't get them back in schools. Again, the evil teachers' unions, Randy, the Demon, Weingarten, and our absolutely demonic Biden administration, all hell-bent on destroying children, it seems. Now, that said, they do mention that although COVID was a factor, it wasn't the only factor, because they were seeing this decline back in 2015 as well. They state that other countries have worked with parents, changed the math curricula to make it more fun and less focused on formulas, shifting that focus to creativity and problem solving, which I'd have to conclude means they're not doing math, or at least they're not doing math correctly, in my opinion. See, that's the main reason I love math. That's the main reason that most people who love math. It's based on formulas. It's straight lines and square corners. It's unchanging. It's used to obtain consistent results. It never changes. It just is. Now, I have no problem with creativity, and I think more problem solving should be taught in school, but not at the expense of just plain old math. Of course, the government's solution is to spend more money, because, as we know, that fixes everything. But looking at Statista, we see that when equalized into 2022 and 23 U.S. dollars, the spending per student in elementary and secondary schools in the U.S. has grown from $12,200 per student in 1990 to $18,080 per student in 2021. That's a 50% increase in spending over 20 years, if I do math, and a loss of 20 plus years of test scores, apparently. It almost seems like maybe throwing money at it doesn't really work, and never has worked. But that's the only solution our government has, because they don't know how to math either. The reality is that our education system is broken. It's limping along, mostly thanks to the teachers who actually care, which isn't all of them. I'll be optimistic at this point and say that it's still the majority, but it's none of the leadership of the teachers' unions. They only care about themselves and their incomes. It's not the Department of Education. They only care about themselves and their incomes. It's not the woke, agenda-driven, rainbow-haired, LGBTQIA2+, androgynous they-thems that are allegedly teaching our children. They only care about destroying children by dragging them into the depressed, severely mentally and spiritually sick world that they've created for themselves so they won't be alone in their personal hellscape. Yeah, it's a percentage of teachers, local individuals who view kids as precious, who actually care about children, who want to see them grow and learn and succeed. They're the ones that are making this limp along. And this is why the Department of Education needs to be abolished and destroyed. Not just abolished. I would like to see a constitutional amendment in place that would never allow this nation to create another federal Department of Education again, ever, absent a repeal of the amendment, which is about as close to impossible as anything we can do in this nation. It's nothing but a child-hating, child-destroying, agenda-driven hive of scum and villainy. We must be careful. The current Department of Education was created by the recently deceased President Jimmy Carter, now, at worst, the second worst president ever, thanks to President Joe the Vegetable Biden. It was officially formed on October 17th, 1979, 45 years ago. I am older than the Department of Education. This means that we went 200 years without a Department of Education. And look around you. Just look at what this nation accomplished without a federal department telling us how to educate, groom, trans, and psychologically manipulate our children. Someone give me one good reason why they should continue to exist. What value do they actually bring to the table? Well, according to the department, they serve 4 key functions. 1, establishing policies on federal financial aid for education and distributing as well as monitoring those funds. 2, collecting data on America's schools and disseminating research. 3, focusing national attention on key educational issues. And 4, prohibiting discrimination and ensuring equal access to education. So, they take in tax dollars, they pay their employees, then distribute the remaining tax dollars back to the states from whence they came in the first place. Now, some states receive more money than they contribute. Some receive less than they contribute. And although I know that West Virginia is one that receives more than they pay in, I think I've already shown that more money isn't the answer. West Virginia, I think, could do much more with less money and no federal interference than they could with more money and a forced woke agenda. So they collect data. Okay, there's no reason we need a federal body doing that. The states or a private firm could do that, and a private firm could compile all the data much more efficiently and more cost-effectively than our current overbloated bureaucracy. They focus national attention on key educational issues. Yeah, I think their focus has been very clear over the last number of years, and, we don't need any more of that. And they prohibit discrimination and ensure equal access. Again, they're not needed for this. The states can manage their own programs, and in this day and age, regardless of how much they want to tell us that we're a super racist, super discriminatory country, we just aren't. That's a gaslighting lie. In other words, the Department of Education does absolutely nothing. They bring nothing to the table. They have zero value. They are a drain, a leech on society and our tax dollars. I hope I wasn't unclear. And this isn't the first time we figured out that we didn't need a Department of Education. I didn't know this before now, but apparently we tried this in 1867. During President Andrew Johnson's presidency, following the Civil War, Ohio Rep. And future President James Garfield introduced the bill to create a U.S. Department of Education, supported by abolitionists. Johnson was basically indifferent to it, and apparently it was created, and then within a year, it was demoted by Congress to simply an office in the Department of the Interior. Basically, the idea was born out of a sort of a common schooling system that had been formed in the northern states since the 1830s. There was segregation by race, sometimes by gender, but they did advocate for education for every child. The southern Confederate states were definitely more illiterate at this time. The slaves were kept illiterate, and with the ravages of the Civil War, the illiteracy rate went up. The North attributed their victory over the South in part to their educational system, so they figured that this was a good way to do education, by having governmental, somewhat central control. The department had a tiny budget and essentially acted as a data repository. They collected and analyzed educational data to ensure the education of children, black or white, was progressing. There was some anger in primarily the South about the mandate to educate formerly enslaved blacks, and in general this was seen as a radical move by a federal government, as a central agency had never been involved with education in the past. The arguments to keep it were basically the same as they are today. They collect data, they compare states, and they measure themselves against other countries, trying to show that we just love educating our children, and you can tell because look how much money we spend. About a year later, because it was so controversial for a number of reasons, it was demoted to only an office in the Department of the Interior, and it stayed there for decades, and that's kind of where it should have stayed, at best. Now, up until about 1958, states managed their own education and their own funding of their own education. They did this through various means, eventually settling on income or sales taxes to finance the schools. Even today, the federal government is technically a small percentage of school funding, but as I said, it's kind of a money laundering scheme where money goes from the state to the Fed, then back to the state. So technically, the federal government has little financial input into each state, but it all flows through the Fed, or at least most. In 1958, the National Defense Education Act was introduced, which was the largest education controlling push by the Fed in the history of our country, at least to that point. This gave the Fed some teeth into what was taught in schools, and it gave them some control over where funds should go in schools. And then the dominoes began to fall. In 1965, they passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which doubled the Fed's funding to schools. In 1975, they passed the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which allowed the Fed more input into how states educated those with special needs. In 1983, they passed the Nation at Risk Act, which started the standards-based reform movement. 2001, of course, brought us No Child Left Behind, which was supposed to focus on disadvantaged students and make sure all kids were achieving at an acceptable level. But it's universally agreed that it was a massive failure, actually harming the higher performing students more than helping anybody. And in 2015, we got the Every Student Succeeds Act, which looks to have done nothing, but apparently mandates states include the per student spending by school on report cards. And with that, education was fixed, and you're welcome. So Trump came out in October of 2023, over a year before he won the election. The election, the one he just won. Both the electoral and the popular vote. Yeah, that election. As he was laying out his plans for the United States, he said this, quote, "One other thing I'll be doing very early in the administration is closing up the Department of Education in Washington, D.C., and sending all education and education work and needs back to the states. We want them to run the education of our children because they'll do a much better job of it." Now, he made the point that we're spending more money than any other country on education, and we're at the bottom of every list. Now, I don't think either of those claims are to be taken literally, but we're definitely one of the top spenders, if not the top, and we're absolutely nowhere near where we should be as a country as compared to the rest of the world. It's pretty pitiful, to be honest. This has actually been codified in the Republican National Convention official party platform as well, and as of now, Trump has tapped Linda McMahon to be the Secretary of Education with the intent and the role and the goal of shutting it down. Will it happen? I don't know. It should. We have no need for it. It's done nothing positive ever for this country. But even if they shut it down, it's questionable if they'll actually send everything back to the states or if they'll just kind of parse things out into other federal departments while giving the states a sliver more control. In my opinion, it's a cancer. You either wipe it out completely before it kills you, or it kills you. So we'll see what they do. One thing we know for sure, being a teacher isn't the most attractive job, and the Department of Education hasn't done anything to make it better. Being part of a teachers' union does absolutely nothing except make the union bosses rich and shockingly powerful. Our little gargoyle friend, Randy Weingarten, made over $550,000 in 2024 alone. Must be nice. So we all know that teachers are in critically short supply in nearly every single state. In a study at the end of 2023, it was found that there were over 55,000 teacher openings across the United States, and that didn't count Arkansas, New Hampshire, New York, Ohio, Oregon, Vermont, or Wyoming because they didn't submit data. Florida had the worst gap at nearly 5,300 openings. Georgia and North Carolina both had over 3,000. Arizona, Wisconsin, Illinois, Louisiana, Mississippi, Kentucky, and Virginia all had over 2,000 openings. And Washington, Nevada, Texas, Oklahoma, Iowa, Kansas, Ohio, West Virginia, and Massachusetts all had over 1,000 openings. When they compared the salary competitiveness of teachers with all employees, they found that the average salary has lost ground for teachers from January 2018 to the end of 2023. Being a teacher was already slightly less competitive in salary than the average job at the beginning of 2018, and it dropped another 5% over those nearly 6 years. And what does all this lead to? Well, the dumbing of the United States, really. Found on en.as.com, headline, "The one skill that Gen Z is losing, one that humans have had for 5,500 years. So, what's the skill that Gen Z is screwing up for the rest of us? Something we've all kept alive for 5,500 years of humanity. Handwriting. Now, just a quick sidebar, that's an interesting number, isn't it? 5,500 years of humanity? Seeing as though modern humans, Homo sapiens, evolved on the scene about 300,000 years ago, possibly up to 800,000 years ago, right? I mean, you'd almost think that we would have developed handwriting well before just 5,500 years ago. What an odd number of years. Anyway, with all of the digital devices, the art, skill, or even basic ability to write something by hand is allegedly dying. In fact, a recent study claims that 40% of Gen Z is losing the ability to write by hand. Professors have remarked that when asked, students from Gen Z struggle when asked to put down the device and pick up a pen. They stated that the handwriting is deteriorated, appearing messy and hard to read. And look, I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I'm Gen X. My handwriting has always been bad. I had my own electronic typewriter fairly early in life, but it was only used sometimes. The first computer I used was in middle school, and those were some Apple IICs or IIEs, I don't remember. And my first, I guess, modernish computer was in our lab my senior year of high school, a Mac with something like a 9-inch grayscale screen. And then in college, I actually stepped into the world of Microsoft Windows. And I use the computer now a lot. I mean, look, I'm a couple podcast episodes away from 2 million words typed since I started this silly thing. But like I said, my handwriting has always been just terrible. I remember vividly when my dad would force me to sit up in my room and copy the back of a book, usually one of my Doctor Who books, to practice my penmanship. I remember the tears. It was traumatic. And I'm not confident it ever helped. I still do a lot of handwriting. Take a lot of notes while Bible reading. I take a lot of notes in church. My handwriting is just bad. The one thing I've noticed, at least I think I've noticed, is that my brain seems to move faster than my hand. I find myself skipping letters or smashing the first half of one word with the next word because I'm thinking faster than I'm writing, and I wonder if that has something to do with it. No idea. So I don't know if devices are making sloppier handwriting, but I have seen some of the modern young celebrities as they're signing autographs, and they have no idea how to even hold a pen. One, specifically, that comes to mind is Lizzo. The large black millennial woman who yells at us for fat shaming, while she, behind the scenes, fat shames her own dancers, and singing some of the worst, talentless tripe, wearing some of the most revealing things, and getting angry when people mock her choices. Yeah, that Lizzo. The way she holds a pen just makes you feel uncomfortable. Now, shockingly, Lizzo is actually an unbelievably talented person in a number of musical ways, but of course talent isn't what makes the big bucks, so she does what she does. I don't know. Device usage is probably taking its toll on the handwriting of younger generations, and we've likely all heard that over the last decade, more schools are dropping the requirement to learn cursive writing, which again, to be honest, I just don't write in cursive. I print. It's maybe a hybrid of print with a little cursive flair in there, but mostly it's print. That said, the problem isn't really with writing in cursive, except that people should really be able to sign their name, in cursive. The problem is if cursive isn't taught, then cursive can't be read, and so many old important documents are written in cursive. Even worse, we're lucky kids are learning anything at all these days. To try to address the teacher shortage, one state has taken a unique approach. Found on WBLS.com, headline, New Jersey teachers no longer need to pass reading, writing, math skill test. So, I know that in West Virginia, and I'm guessing most states, if you hold a college degree in anything, you can likely be a teacher somewhere K through 12. In West Virginia, if you hold a bachelor's, there are 4 options as to how to become a teacher. Some have to do with more schooling. Some are alternative certifications granted in times of critical needs or shortages. But as a degree holder in anything, you can pretty much teach something with very little extra educational effort. Now, if you only have a high school diploma or a GED, pretty much need to go back to school to get a degree or a license. If you've got nothing, you can still help as an assistant within very specific boundaries. So West Virginia says that teachers must meet a minimum standard in order to be a teacher, and that's West Virginia, arguably viewed as one of the hillbilliest states in the Union. But New Jersey looks at meeting specific qualifications in order to be a teacher and says, forget about it. An assembly bill signed by Governor Phil Murphy in June of 2024, creating a new law which took effect in January 1st, 2025, says that, quote, teachers are no longer required to pass basic skills proficiency tests to teach in classrooms. And that seems to me kind of like a bad idea. Now, fewer students are going to school to be teachers. Teachers are becoming harder to hire and harder to retain. The article says this is due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which is what a 2023 state task force reported. But to that, I'd have to proclaim, bunk. We can't perpetually cry COVID for everything. At some point, we need to just kind of suck it up and say, hey, this is screwed up and it needs to be fixed now. Lawmakers stated that these tests are simply too costly, too redundant, and just create too much of a burden on prospective teachers. So the now law states that except for very specific situations, quote, the State Board of Education shall not require a candidate seeking any instructional certificate to complete a Commissioner of Education approved test of basic reading, writing, and mathematical skills, including, but not limited to, the Praxis Core Academic Skills for Educators test in order to obtain an instructional certificate. State Senator Jim Beach, shocker, a Democrat, says, quote, we need more teachers. This is the best way to get them. And he wasn't alone. The bill passed the Senate by a vote of 34-2. As a side note, this was a vote of 21 Dems and 13 Republicans voting for the bill in the Senate, and 52 Dems, 23 Republicans voting for it in the Assembly. Additionally, the New Jersey Education Association liked removing those, quote, unnecessary barriers to entering the profession, and I'm absolutely positive they did. The article states that, quote, to become certified in New Jersey, candidates must obtain a college degree in an accredited teacher preparation program, complete months of teaching experience inside a school setting, and pass Praxis 2 core subject tests specific to their degree. Now, I guess that's good, but if people aren't willing to be teachers because of basic proficiency tests, that should tell us something, right? I mean, are people who want to be teachers, which theoretically takes a lot of work if you're doing it right and actually care about your profession, are they like, proficiency test? Nah, not worth it. And if that's not the problem with getting teachers, then why are we removing the proficiency tests? There's something more going on here. At least that's what I think. There's something wrong there. Proverbs 22:6 tells us, train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. Now, I believe I've mentioned this verse before, quite a while back, and the problem that we have with this verse is we take it out of context, and it creates problems for so many parents. See, we have a problem when we read the Bible, where we take something, a descriptive text, and we turn it into a prescriptive text. In other words, texts that tell us about something, if we agree with that something, well, we turn it into our own little law, a little mandate. And that's wrong. We got to stop doing that. Our feelings on a topic don't dictate the context of scriptures. The context of the scriptures are simply what they are. And there is literally only one correct interpretation of the scriptures. Now, with regard to verses like those found in Proverbs, we tend to look at them as mandates or promises. And generally speaking, they aren't either of those. Again, we need to stop doing this. So many parents, until I understood what I was doing with this verse, me included, agonize over the fact that we had our kids in church, in Sunday school, in Awana, in VBS. We prayed with them, for them. We read them stories and Bible lessons. We corrected and disciplined, and yet the child rebels, sometimes in small ways, sometimes large, or decides to completely turn from what you've taught for years, and they go their own way. But see, Proverbs 22:6 isn't a promise, even though it kind of sounds like one. This is advice. This isn't a guarantee, but what is guaranteed is that if you don't train up your child in the correct way, they will have a much more difficult life. They're much less likely to turn to Christ. As parents, we do our part, being faithful to God, probably failing multiple times more than we get things right, but doing our part is what God requires of us. Beyond that, the salvation of our children, the direction of our children, we need to trust God, trust the Holy Spirit. And sometimes children simply walk away from the faith, from what we taught them. That's how we know that this isn't a promise. But it is kind of a mandate. We are to train them up correctly to the best of our ability. But it's not a promise of the outcome. And to be honest, we take this verse and apply it to our faith only, and it probably is intended that way. But good advice is good advice, right? Why couldn't we apply that to the topic of education as well? Reading, writing, math. No, I'm not going to do the 3 R's. And all the rest. Don't we owe it to our kids to try to give them the best education we can? And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that kids should all be homeschooled or put into the best private Christian schools or something like that. I mean, those things are fine. But if you can't, or if you don't want to, that's your call as a parent. But in whatever way we can, we should be training them up in the way they should go to the best of our ability, the best way we know how. Now, this is where private schools or homeschooling comes in, cooperative homeschooling or charter schools, or simply school choice. This is also why we should dump teachers' unions, because they facilitate the retention of terrible teachers, of abusive teachers, of agenda-driven teachers, while discouraging those who actually care about the kids. Removing unions, upping standards, increasing pay, which would be different state to state, implementing merit raises, not union raises for everyone regardless of their performance, and supporting teachers, working with parents while enforcing acceptable student behavior, and for that matter, acceptable parental behavior, rather than allowing good teachers to be verbally assaulted or worse by students and parents. That would make a real difference in the education in America, right? There was a story I heard quite a while ago, and it was claimed to be a true story. Back in the days of the little one-room schoolhouse, a teacher who had some issues in his past was teaching the students and was really liked by those students. Now, one day his past caught up with him. Some man with a gun came in the door, aimed the gun at the teacher, and intended to shoot him for whatever had happened in the past. A number of students stood up, drew their pistols, aimed at the intruder, and said something along the lines of, "We don't know what this is about, but we sure do like our teacher. You're not going to do a thing to him." And the intruder turned and left. Now look at our schools today. Is the Department of Education and unions, are they to blame for what we have today? Yep, they absolutely are. And you can throw in the spineless and or evil politicians as well. Will getting rid of the Department of Education fix the problems we've got? I mean, not entirely, and definitely not right away. How about dumping the worthless unions? That'll definitely help. Again, it'll take a little time to filter out and replace all the teachers who are interested in anything and everything except teaching. How about getting rid of the politicians who facilitate this garbage? Yeah, they need to go too. But really, the most impactful thing any of us can do is train up children in the way they should go. That doesn't necessarily limit you to your own kid. If you have kids, you can teach Sunday school or work in any of the various church-type clubs. You can be a public school teacher or teaching assistant, or partner with other adults in the area for a cooperative homeschool. You could be a mentor, a big brother or big sister, a good example at church. Hillary Clinton said that it takes a village to raise a child. She was absolutely right. But not the village of the damned like she was implying. If you've ever participated or seen a baby dedication at church, the parents promise to raise their child in the way he or she should go, and the church body promises to help raise that child as well and help the parents in any way possible. Generally, that's an empty promise. It's like answering fine when asked how you're doing, or like taking a vote for something in a Baptist business meeting. The fine, the all in favor say aye, and the promise are all kind of expected responses, regardless of what you really think. But we need to take the promise as a parent or as a member of the family of God seriously. Children are our greatest treasure. Just look at how they're spoken of in the Bible. Look at how Jesus spoke of them, which, as a side note, is just another reason we know that Christianity is the one true religion, as it's the only one that actually values women and children. So, hopefully, Trump will be able to get Congress to come through on his promise to get rid of the Department of Education and at least turn it back to the states, which would be much better. Not perfect, but better. Regardless, you and I need to step up and do our part to the best of our ability. We need to be in prayer for our own children, for kids we're associated with in church or wherever, and children just in general, as they are clearly a major focus of Satan's attacks. And then we need to trust God's sovereign plan, knowing that nothing happens outside of his control and that the Holy Spirit is at work in this world. Unless you've been living under a rock, and if you have, if there is any room under there for me, I kind of like to join you maybe most of the time, really, these days, to be honest. But unless you've been under that rock, or maybe you're Amish, in which case, how are you hearing this? You've likely heard a lot about the wildfires raging in California right now. Now, I'm definitely not going to make fun of anything to do with that. I'm also not going to go too deeply into it before delving into the topic I've chosen for this segment, but let's tackle a few things and kind of get them out of the way. As of January 17th, there are 27 confirmed dead. That number is expected to rise. Let's pray that it doesn't rise much. At the peak, there were about 200,000 people affected by evacuation orders. Now it's back under 100,000, but about that many are also in warning zones for evacuation as well. The number of people who have lost their homes is still to be calculated. J.P. Morgan has estimated that the total losses could reach $50 billion, with insured losses only around $20 billion. Tens of thousands of acres have been burned, a lot of those acres being towns, communities, and cities. So what started the fires? Well, we don't know, at least not right now. If you listen to the science eggheads and the politicians and the news anchors, it's absolutely the fault of global warming. One thing that I'm positive of is that it was absolutely not started or perpetuated because of global warming. In fact, the worst wildfire that region has ever had was in the late 1800s, well before the Industrial Revolution and that super scary CO2 bleh floating around in our atmosphere. God set up this world to manage itself, including taking out the trash, revitalizing itself. Part of that management system is actually fire. Wildfires are natural and necessary. California, for a number of reasons, mostly due to activist-driven anti-science type reasons, basically stopped doing controlled burns and cleaning out all of the debris and underbrush found on the forest floor. The reality is that wildfires have always happened, whether we were there to see them or not. They serve to clear out all of that underbrush, revitalize the soil with much-needed nutrients, and in some cases, fire is needed in order for some seeds to sprout. God knew what he was doing when he created this planet, but of course, God is so last millennia, man knows better now. Additionally, there were reports of fire hydrants with no water. Confirmed reports, let me add. I can't imagine being a firefighter. Can't really imagine being a firefighter at all, but I can't imagine being a firefighter getting ready to do some firefighting, hooking up to a hydrant, and nothing but air comes out. Trump has come out fairly brutally against Governor Newsom, or Newscum, as he cleverly calls him, speaking about how poorly he's managed California. And Trump is absolutely right. Newsom is more interested in his woke agenda than he is in protecting the residents of his state. One thing that Trump has been blasted on is his statement about the lack of water due to trying to protect some stupid fish. And although the fact checkers went into overdrive on that one, the reality is that the Delta smelt was in fact the stupid fish that resulted in a reduction in water flows in California because they were more important than humans. See, when we're worried about a stupid fish more than humans, whether that be for, drinking water, firefighting water, water for farmland, we've kind of crossed the line into insanity. Oh, and welcome to California. In fact, I heard the other day that this stupid fish isn't even a unique species like they thought it was. It's actually just the same, maybe a slight variation as another species of fish, which means it was never endangered in the first place, so nothing should have ever been considered for this fish. Science! There are rumors of water reservoirs that were never filled or were closed or had been taken offline, and fire departments apparently were not required to be informed of these changes. Again, the fact checkers are working their pencils to the bone in order to make this about climate change, not decades of Democrat control and green wacko activist policies. So the Palisades fire was the first to erupt, if I recall, and is the largest and still the least contained of the four main fires taking place right now. I think we're down to 3 fires now. Back in 2019, the LA Department of Water and Power started a project to replace century-old wooden power poles in Topanga State Park, which was partially burned, including historic buildings. With this latest fire, they were going to replace these poles with metal poles, and at the same time, they were going to widen the fire access lanes and install fire and wind-resistant power lines. And why? Well, because they identify this area as having an elevated fire risk. Now, the project was stopped immediately when an amateur botanist was hiking through the area during the beginning stages of the work and saw that the careless, environment-hating ogres that were doing the work had literally stepped on some flowering shrubs known as Bronton's milkvetch. Apparently, there are only a few thousand of these stupid bushes in the wild, so this green nut complained and stopped the entire project. So instead of reducing the elevated fire risk, the city ended up paying about $2 million in fines and had to reverse the entire project and replant the stupid shrubs. There's a good chance that all those stupid shrubs have now been burned to the ground at this point, and good. So did this start the fire or make it worse by them not being able to do this? I don't know. No idea. Probably not, to be honest. But it gives you the mindset that's been going on for years in the hippie state. Governor Newsom has demanded answers. He wants to know who we need to blame for these fires. And in my opinion, and the opinion of so many others on both sides of the aisle, all he needs to really do is go home and just look in the mirror. He'd have pretty much the main perp just that fast. The rumors and conspiracies are swirling like a tornado or a fire-nado about what Gavin did or didn't know, did or didn't do, or how he made things better or worse. And look, I have no idea. You can throw in that DEI hire of a Los Angeles mayor as well, for that matter. I'd say that if we have honest inquiries, honest fact-finders, at some point, we'll know who did what, and if anyone should be prosecuted for actions that directly related to these fires. I don't think any of us believe we'll get an honest inquiry. It'll be political grandstanding. Nothing will be resolved. We'll never be told the alleged reasons or contributing factors for these fires, and this will all happen again. Okay, that's about as deep as I want to go into the fires themselves, except for reminding you to pray for all those affected by the fires. And yes, this is going to come as a kind of a shocker for some, but I also mean the celebrities and the uber wealthy. I mean those on the left and the right side of the political aisle, and I mean praying for those who wouldn't even look in your direction if you suffered the same fate. I also want you to remember to be in prayer for those particularly in North Carolina who are still reeling from Hurricane Helene. And lastly, if you're someone interested in donating something to help in relief of either of these, or of any disaster, for that matter, there are infinity groups and organizations who would love to take your money. please look very carefully into who they support. What percentage of your money goes to the actual victims versus the administrative costs, and what kind of agendas they're aligned with. And let me just say this, if you're donating to a church, find out who they're working through. Okay, because they're typically not going to be doing anything on their own. They're going to compile and send it to someone else. Now, I can tell you that I have trust in a few groups, like Matthew 25 Ministries, Samaritan's Purse, as well as others. But the one that I use when I feel compelled to contribute to disaster relief efforts is Mercury One. This one was started by Glenn Beck and his Blaze Network. He's not in charge of it. It's not a Mormon thing. It's a group that helps in time of need. Their goal is to be the first in and the last out. Their philosophy is that 100% of all donations go to relief efforts. They do this by having a single annual ball, selling tickets and raffling off prizes and selling behind-the-scenes passes or meet and greets. And they use all that money from that one ball every year to pay all of their administrative costs for the year. They've been around for a number of years now, and thus far, per their reports, they've been able to meet their mission and goals every year. Case in point, remember the massive wildfires in Hawaii, in Maui? Yeah, most people have likely forgotten by now. Those were, if you can believe it, in August of 2023. Mercury One is still there, on the ground, working to help those who are simply forgotten by our government and FEMA and other organizations and groups. So look, I'll put links to all three of those that I mentioned that I recommend in the notes, but my personal preference is Mercury One. Okay, now on to the point of this segment. There's a phenomenon that seems to happen in every single disaster, and we're seeing it again with the fires in California. And I think we really need to think through what we're saying, what we're being told, what's being claimed, and what words actually mean. Miracle. What does that word mean to you? No, I'm just kidding. I don't care. It really doesn't matter to me what it means to you or what it means to me for that matter. It matters what it means. We tend to put too much importance on us, especially with regard to theology, oddly enough. Have you heard the saying, God said it, I believe it, that settles it? Really? You sure about that? Because tell me how you or I matter in that equation. Let's just say that I didn't believe it. That would neither create doubt that God said it, nor compromise the settledness of the matter. That should be more accurately stated as God said it, that settles it. That's all that's needed. Same thing if you're a participant in or leading a Bible study of some kind. Never allow yourself or others to ask the question, what does that verse or what does that passage say to you? What does that mean to you? Who cares? Not God, I can tell you that. The correct question is, what does it say? And if you want to make it more clear as to what you're actually asking, you could say, what does this say in context? So, back to the idea of miracles. Have you ever experienced a miracle? We often say that the birth of a child is a miracle. We'll see someone at death's door in the hospital, hooked up to every machine in the hospital. They'll recover, and we'll say that was a miracle. You're driving along and suddenly an accident happens all around you, and you escape without a scratch. We'll call that a miracle. So, are those miracles? Well, let's look at Got Questions for the definition of miracle, as I feel it's a good definition. Quote, an event that involves the direct and powerful action of God, transcending the ordinary laws of nature and defying common expectations of behavior. Got that? An event that involves the direct and powerful action of God, transcending the ordinary laws of nature and defying common expectations of behavior. So the first miracle of Jesus was turning water into wine, right? We all agree with that. Do we see water transitioning immediately or over time into wine in nature? No. Did anyone before, anyone at that wedding, or anyone today expect water to transition into wine? There may be a number of people who would like that to happen, but no, nobody expects that. When a baby is born, is this an event that involves the direct and powerful action of God? Not really. Again, you have to define your boundaries here, but God set up the process to be a natural process. His providence is involved, definitely, and he knits us together in our mother's womb, but there is nothing unique and otherly about this process. Are babies being born following the ordinary laws of nature? Yes. Do we expect pregnancies to end with the baby being born? Of course we do. When it doesn't end that way, for whatever reason, we call it a tragedy because the expectation is that it will happen as expected. So is a baby being born a miracle? No. It's amazing. It's glorious. It's something to praise and worship God for. But it's simply not a miracle. Someone recovering from death's door, is that a miracle? Maybe, but most likely not. It may be unexpected, may be unbelievable, but that doesn't necessarily make it a miracle. Look, I'm praying for a miracle for a coworker right now. I've mentioned him before. He's got stage 4 cancer. He's had spots just everywhere in his body. And although they seem to have that at least in control, all of the radiation and chemo has resulted in bone loss and extreme constant pain to the point where he can only be on his feet for maybe 15 minutes at a time. He's a guy who his entire life has been on his tools. And most recently, he's been managing those maintenance folks, which requires him to be up and moving all the time. He's been out of work for the last year, working from home. Thankfully, he can do a lot of what he does sitting at his kitchen table on his laptop, but that's not what he does. Now, I'm praying for his bones to rebuild and heal, for the pain to go away, for the cancer to disappear. If that happened overnight, if that happened over the course of a week, would that be a miracle? I would be inclined to call it that. If he heals slowly but surely over the course of months, following a more normal expectation, following the doctor's advice, taking the medicines, etc., would that be a miracle? Probably not. It would still be the hand of God. It would be God's providence, but it wouldn't be a miracle. So here's a good one. Book of Genesis. The serpent speaks to Eve. Was that a miracle? No, I don't think so. I've said before that I don't believe that Satan indwelt the snake, because why would God punish all snakes if the snake really had no choice in this matter? If he was just an innocent creature that was indwelt against his will. No, I believe the snake was a willing participant, willing to speak to Eve on behalf of Satan, speaking the words he was given to say. But was the speaking a miracle? Well, both Adam and Eve were standing right there, and neither of them seemed like the snake speaking was anything out of the ordinary. So look, if a snake spoke today, that would be, first, horrifying, but that would be a miracle, as they don't have the ability to speak. But back then, I'd have to say, no, it doesn't appear that it was a miracle at all. It looks like it was ordinary. All throughout the Bible, we do see miracles. Some of them, God used nature in an unnatural way to accomplish the miracle, like parting the Red Sea or having the sun stand still or go backwards. Others defy nature entirely, Elijah being taken up to heaven, never actually dying, Lazarus being raised from the dead, the plagues of Moses. Some of them were nature being used or supernaturally. Others defied nature entirely. How about the biggest miracle? No, not Jesus raising from the dead. If you're a born-again individual, that is literally the largest miracle, bigger than anything else. Remember in Matthew 9, Jesus was confronted by the scribes when he told the paralytic that his sins were forgiven. He asked them if it was easier to say your sins are forgiven or get up and walk. Well, they didn't answer, so he told them that in order for them to know that he was the Son of God, he looked at the paralytic and told him to get up and walk, which he did instantly. See, saying that your sins are forgiven, well, that's simple. I can say that. I can't do it, but I can say it. But to look at someone paralyzed and say, get up and walk, I can also do that. But I can't make them walk, and they're not going to walk by me saying that. See, according to Jesus, telling someone who's paralyzed to walk, for him, no big deal. But a seemingly impossible miracle is the forgiveness of the sins that have been committed against a thrice holy God. So the salvation of a human soul, your salvation, my salvation, is this something that involves the direct and powerful action of God? Yes, this is not of ourselves. It is a gift of God only. We contribute nothing but the unsaved, sinful heart. Does this transcend the ordinary laws of nature? Oh, good grief, yes. Prior to God acting on us, regenerating our hearts, opening our eyes, granting us saving faith, we simply hate God. We have no interest in God. We, like most of humanity, want God dead, to be gone, to keep his big old nose out of our business. We are dead in our trespasses and sins, and a dead man can't revive himself. And then does salvation defy common expectations of behavior? Yeah, as I said, we want nothing to do with God. At no time would we ever choose God. We would never choose salvation on our own. In fact, except for the miracle of salvation by God, if it were up to us in any way, we would lose our salvation mere seconds after we were saved. Being saved and being safe in that salvation, that is the biggest miracle of them all. So coming back to the California fires and the natural disasters in general, found on theblaze.com, headline, Sacred Tabernacle miraculously survives devastation of California fires. Fire captain hints it was saved for divine reason. The same story found on lamag.com, headline, Twisted steel, charred bricks, exploded windows. What remains unscathed? A miracle. A church in the, quote, heart of the Pacific Palisades, the Corpus Christi Catholic Church, was absolutely devastated by the fire. It was, as stated, quote, reduced to rubble, everything gone. As LA Mag explains it, quote, the fire burned so hot that steel gates welcoming worshippers blasted open in molten heat, windows exploded into sharp, smoky shards, a chandelier over the altar burned black, rows of pews turned to ash. That sounds horrible. I mean, in all seriousness, that sounds terrible. But they go on, and I'm going to read most of this article.
Quote, but unscathed in the ravaged sanctuary is something that LAFD Captain Frank Lima, who often slipped into Mass here, believes is a miracle. The 14 delicate stained glass windows representing the Stations of the Cross. It goes against logic, Lima told Los Angeles as he stood in the rubble of the decimated place of worship, which was also home to a Catholic school, and stared at the intact art depicting Christ's last day on earth, his suffering, death, and resurrection. The glass should have broken off really quick in these kind of conditions with full roof collapse and very heavily charred brick. It was like an oven in here, Lima said in awe. Every station of the cross is immaculate. It's unbelievable. In the days after the fire, he stood in front of the granite altar dusted with construction remnants alongside his friend Ed Kelly, the president of the International Association of Firefighters, where Lima is also an official representing his brethren in the LAFD, to say a prayer to Saint Florian, the patron saint of firefighters. The fires were so dangerous, it is a miracle we didn't lose any firefighter lives, Lima said. Seeing the Stations of the Cross, the community coming together, the angels were definitely looking out for us that night, especially firefighters. It's a hopeful sign in all this loss. On top of that altar, the Blessed Sacrament of the Tabernacle, made of solid brass, had also been recovered unharmed and was returned to Corpus Christi Church pastor Monsignor Liam Kidney. He announced this week to his parishioners. The 300-pound box that protected the Holy Book was found by Station 69 Captain Brian Nasser and carried it out with the help of members of his fatigued crew to the pastor's great joy. My dear parishioners, Kidney wrote, the Corpus Christi Church Tabernacle survived the fire and was returned to us by the fire department.
So, it's a miracle that the stained glass windows didn't blow out, a miracle that no lives of firefighters were lost, and a miracle that the altar and the Blessed Sacrament was unharmed. Was it? Let me remind you, this is the Catholic Church. Catholic is not Christian. We need to be very clear here. Catholicism is best defined as a cult. It's using real Christianity in a way that's not Christian for its own purposes. Why would God miraculously protect those artifacts, giving the impression that this church is one that God loves? Why didn't God protect the entire church, for that matter? Was this a miracle? Continuing on in the article.
Quote, the hope contained in those intact stained glass windows and the found tabernacle are among the many spiritually inspiring recoveries in the ruins, like the sacred Torah scrolls saved from the flames at the Pasadena Jewish Temple and Center in Pasadena. A bell tower still stands as a beacon in the ruins that housed the Altadena Baptist Church.
Okay, so are those miracles. Again, neither the Jewish temple nor the Baptist church were saved, just a few things that are associated with those.
Quote, This week, Ron Rivlin, an art collector and owner of the Revolver Gallery on Sunset Boulevard in West Hollywood, sifted through the remnants of his Pacific Palisades home this week, hoping to find anything, he told Los Angeles. There were 2 of the 3 numbers that marked his street address among the mangled rebar and charred drywall, but little else. The endeavor felt fruitless until Rivlin climbed down a ladder into what used to be a swimming pool with a friend, with a shovel, glimmering in the sun the stainless steel from a 15-foot statue, an aptly named artwork that was the only thing among his priceless collection to survive, Michael Benisti's Broken But Together. Rivlin believes it was no accident that among the hundreds of artworks in his home, Andy Warhol originals and Keith Haring paintings, the Benisti sculpture is what he found. Since his house burnt to the ground, he has poured his energy into doing what he can for fellow Angelenos, especially in his beloved neighborhood. Find what symbolizes the struggle we face as humanity, he said. Although we're all a little broken, we have each other to get us through this.
So that sculpture, or whatever it was, well, that's not a religious icon. If the others were miracles, is this also a miracle? Moving to another story found on CBN.com, headline, An Actual Miracle! Multiple church sites burned down in LA, but one remarkable story stands out. Well, this is the story of Calvary Church of Pacific Palisades. They start the article with a summary of where the region stood at the time of the writing, then narrowing their focus from the overall picture to the region to the fact that the wildfires destroyed Altadena Community Church and many homes of those who attended that church, and the pastor's message that they, the people, are the church. The building is a building. They can worship anywhere. And he's absolutely correct. Likewise, Altadena United Methodist Church burned to the ground, but the pastor similarly put out a message to his congregants that they, the people, are the church. The building was a building. But Calvary Church of Pacific Palisades and their 70,000 square foot structure, the church with an adjoining school, were mostly undamaged. The brand new pastor stated that the fire started about 1 mile from the church, and that now that he's been able to survey the church, the sanctuary is probably a total loss and will need to be rebuilt. Quote, but miraculously, the rest of the property is nearly untouched. As bad as the sanctuary is, the fact that this is the only damage is an actual miracle. The rest of the campus and the home we are supposed to move into were both surrounded by fires, but were saved. So this is a Protestant church. So is this a miracle? Is it a miracle that his future home was also saved? Is it a miracle that the sanctuary of the church was destroyed, but the rest of the property was mostly okay? How many miracles can you recall that were done in the Bible, and they were done mostly okay? On January 14th, someone posted on Facebook a picture of a completely burned down neighborhood, apparently in California, with one lone house with a bright red roof standing apparently unscathed. The label across the picture stated, quote, this is the power of Allah Almighty. Allah Almighty saved the mosque. Was this a miracle? Would God miraculously save a mosque while Religion News Service reports that as of January 11th, there were at least a dozen houses of worship, used in a very loose general sense of the term, that had been destroyed? I can't find where we know how many Christian churches, or for that matter, Catholic churches or Jewish temples, have been destroyed, but we know that there have been many. So would God miraculously save this mosque? Now, if you go to try to find this post, it no longer exists. It was taken down because fact checkers from seemingly everywhere call this out as completely false. This wasn't California. And it isn't a mosque. It's a house in Hawaii, in Maui, in the midst of the ruins of those fires from nearly 1.5 years ago. So, wait a minute, what about that house in that fire? Was that a miracle that it was spared? Well, per one article, quote, Trip Milliken, who is the owner of the house, reportedly credited the miracle to the heavy-gauge metal roof he and his wife, Dora Atwater Milliken, installed in the house during its recent renovation. The couple had also removed all the vegetation around the house and installed river stones. The only damage incurred by the fire was a PVC pipe on the walls. So did old Tripp call it a miracle, or did the author of the article call it a miracle? I don't know. Was it a miracle? According to an undated article on Catholic.org, headline, Statues of the Virgin Mary are surviving disasters unscratched, and nobody knows why. The author writes,
Quote, Hurricane Harvey sparks a fire that destroys a home, but a statue of the Virgin Mary survives. A month later, a massive quake rocks Mexico City, flattening buildings. A church collapses, but inexplicably a statue of the Virgin Mary survives without a scratch. And these are simply two cases of the same miracle happening all over. But why? Most people are quick to point out an obvious problem with these stories. Homes are destroyed and lives are being lost, so who cares about a statue? After all, these are just statues. Any sane person would sacrifice a statue to save a home or a life. But there's a pattern here, and it's a pattern associated with Our Lady. Certainly, there is a message here. Indeed, there is. One of the most common depictions of the Virgin Mary is her standing on a snake. Our Lady of Guadalupe stands on a crescent moon, a symbol of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god of the Aztecs. In both cases, the meaning is the same. Our Lady triumphs over evil, sin, and death, thanks to her Son, Jesus Christ. Likewise, when a statue of the Virgin Mary survives unscathed, the meaning is obvious to any believer. Our Lady and our faith triumphs over any disaster, misfortune, or evil. Even if we lose our lives on earth, the souls of the faithful live forever in perfect communion with God. So the miracles are there to remind us in our darkest moments that God still reigns. Our Lady still intercedes for us. The promises of Christ remain. The Bible is filled with stories of disaster. Disasters befell the Israelites. Even Jesus and his apostles suffered. The martyrs suffered. We suffer. But with God, we also triumph. So the atheists can sneer, and the cynics can roll their eyes, but those of us who are paying attention understand the message in these miracles. God is with us, now and forever, and will never abandon us. Even in our darkest moments, Our Lady hears our cries and intercedes for us. Even amid disaster, our faith is not in vain.
So inside all of those just horribly incorrect words, there are definitely nuggets of truth. But is God miraculously saving statues of Our Lady? Would God be propagating the iconography and the idolatry of the Catholic religion with regard to Mary, the mother of Jesus? Look, in none of these instances, I don't want to sound as if I'm trying to tell you the mind of God, okay? But God has given us the gift of logic and His Word. Does it make logical sense that God would miraculously promote these things? And again, why wouldn't God just protect the entire church while all the buildings around it are destroyed? Why just a statue? Found on LDSLiving.com, headline, 5 miraculous stories of temples surviving natural disasters. We're not going to go into this article, but LDS, if you don't know, or you, like I, have trouble keeping all of these different faiths and cults straight, that's short for Latter-day Saints, which most of us know as the Mormon religion. The 5 stories regard a hurricane, a tsunami, another hurricane, an earthquake, and another earthquake. And not all of these stories are actually regarding the Mormon temple being protected. Some are just objects related to a temple. Now look, Mormons do not believe the Bible. They believe their Book of Mormon, and they believe that the Bible was corrupted by man, not a very strong God who can't protect his word from, puny man, just saying. They believe that Jesus was the angel Michael, and that Jesus, or Michael, or whatever he was called at the time, and Satan were brothers, born of God, and one of his many spirit wives on the planet Kolob. Stop laughing, look it up. They believe that man, as a spirit, lives his entire life in heaven, then as part of his maturation, he's sent as a soul into a human baby forming in the womb in order to get experience on the earth. They believe that after Adam sinned, Satan and Michael both presented God with a plan to redeem humanity. Michael would become Jesus, I guess at some point, and he would be a perfect man, a sacrifice for all mankind, redeeming them back to the Father while also giving man free will. Satan presented a more dictatorial plan where he would just make them obey. God chose the plan of Michael, which made Satan mad, which is what caused the battle and his being cast out of heaven. They believe that faithful Mormons will, or at least can, become gods themselves, given their own planet or their own universe or whatever, and they will reign as our God, who used to be just a mere human, reigns over this universe. As they say, quote, as man now is, God once was. As now God is, man may be. They do not believe in the same Bible, or the same God, or the same Jesus, or the same gospel. They are simply another cult. Nearly all of them are bound for hell. Would God miraculously save their temples or related items in natural disasters? It defies logic. We need to be very careful how we use theological language, what claims we make, especially in a lost world. I'm trying to be careful how I say what I'm saying here, and even there, in just a minute, I'm going to give you kind of the caveats to this here. When we make a claim that God told us something, did he? And how do you know for sure? And if you do know for sure, we need to open the canon of Scripture and add his words to the end of the book. Because isn't God speaking today just as authoritative as him speaking then? And if you're not sure that God told you, but you think God told you, why would you ever claim that God told you something, potentially putting words in his mouth that he never said? Two quotes come to mind. One from Justin Peters, who's a pastor and evangelist. Quote, if you want to hear God speak, read your Bible. If you want to hear God speak audibly, read your Bible out loud. The other quote, I'm not really sure who originally said it, but it goes something like this. Quote, if what you claim God told you agrees with the Bible, it's redundant. If what you believe God told you doesn't agree with the Bible, it's an error and not from God. And really, for flippant claims like, God told me to write a book, or God told me to give you a phone call, or whatever, we don't need to do that. And it's dangerous to attribute those words to God. I felt a prompting to call you. I desire to write a book to glorify God. There are other ways to express the feelings, thoughts, and emotions we experience without dragging God into it and attributing something to him that we can't know for sure. Likewise, this world is full of all sorts of very odd things. I guarantee that some are miraculous. Most are likely not. Why would a Catholic church fall down around a statue? Well, being an engineer, I bet if we could model every aspect of the construction and the current condition of that church, the ground, the event, we'd find that the model would agree that the debris would fall around the statue because of physics. We can speak of God's providence. If your house burns to the ground, but you find your family Bible untouched, is it a miracle? Maybe, maybe not. But rather than claim God's supernatural intervention with no way of proving that to be true, we can speak of God's sovereign providence. That is accurate. God, the sovereign God, prior to creation, had the Calvary Church protected, except for the sanctuary, in his plan. He had the statues of Mary sovereignly in his plan for his glory saved, which, knowing how the Catholic world uses those kinds of signs, how they worship Mary as an idol, that may be actually as a judgment on the Catholic parishioners due to the fact that they literally have access to a Bible, the bulk of which is not corrupted in the Catholic Church, but they don't read it. They don't care. They just go by what the Pope or their priest tells them. Look, I don't have the answers as to why a fire would burn everything except for a small gap where a church, or for that matter, a school or a home sits. It could be the wind, could be the terrain, the vegetation. There are many natural factors that could be involved. It doesn't require a miracle necessarily. Now that said, I absolutely believe that God is still a God of miracles and that God still does miracles. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be praying for that. And that he can do as many or as few as he'd like. But as news stories like these come out, and more will start appearing as the fires are brought under control, people begin walking back into burned out areas, as stories like these come out from other disasters, large or small, as bold claims are made of God's direct intervention, test them, use your discernment. Is this in fact an event that involves the direct and powerful action of God, transcending the ordinary laws of nature and defying common expectations of behavior? If you can't positively answer yes to all of those points, do not attribute a miracle to God when you don't know. As I said, speaking of it as God's providence will never be incorrect and will never blaspheme God by attributing something to him that he didn't do. The most common miracle today is when an unsaved, unrepentant, hell-bound sinner is saved by grace through faith, both of which are granted by God, not of himself, but as a gift of God, so that no one can boast. That is a legitimate, bona fide miracle that we can always rightly attribute to God. Words matter, language matters, context matters, and theology matters. Our world today has slipped into a lazy, lax attitude toward matters of God, toward theology. You and I know better, and if you didn't, you do now. So we need to do better. Well, let's be Bereans for the first time in 2025. And let's start this thing right.
We at the Logical Christian Podcast greatly appreciate your continued and continual patronage of the Being Berean segment. We at the Logical Christian Podcast strive to impart accurate and thought-provoking biblical analysis throughout the entirety of the Being Berean segment. That said, we at the Logical Christian Podcast feel it necessary to remind you that the Being Berean segment is comprised of the thoughts, questions, and epiphanies of the host of said Being Berean segment, and as such we strongly recommend that you use maximum discernment and be your own Berean, as it were, rather than just accept the information being discussed during the Being Berean segment. With the Logical Christian Podcast, request that you send questions or comments from the Logical Christian Podcast should any questions, thoughts, epiphanies, or corrections of your own present themselves during the partaking of the Being Berean segment. With that, with the Logical Christian Podcast, pray that you attain both enjoyment and enlightenment from the following Being Berean segment.
Yeah, I ain't getting sued. Okay, hopefully you've been being a Berean on your own time, not waiting for me. It's been about, 7 weeks since we did the last one of these things, due to the holidays and rolling the year from 24 to 25, etc., etc. To refresh your memory, we're in the midst of Deuteronomy. A lot of recap of the Exodus, a lot of restating of laws, etc., as Moses was coming to the end of his time in this life, soon to pass the torch to Joshua. I don't want to waste your time going over the same things we covered in previous segments, so I'm going to try and move quickly through a number of these chapters, but there's some good stuff in there, whether it's repeat or not, so we'll just kind of wing it. So, chapter 19 discusses the cities of refuge for Israelites who unintentionally killed someone else. One interesting point on this is that the person would be innocent until proven guilty. Where have I heard that before? If, however, he was found guilty and was claiming refuge unjustly, he would be handed over to the avenger of the person who was killed, so the avenger could kill the murderer. Moses made it a point to say, quote, "Show no pity. You must purge from Israel the guilt of shedding innocent blood so that it may go well with you." We should take this to heart in our country. Trials were quick. Guilt or innocence was established swiftly based on clear definitions of innocent blood. Modern day, say, unborn children, if you'd like to think of it that way. And if guilty, the sentence was carried out immediately. We would do well to learn from this and save the money that we're spending on prisoners on death row for decades, with our tax dollars paying to sustain their lives and pay their lawyers and pay the judges. Of course, a certain side of the political aisle would like to get rid of the death penalty entirely because it's cruel. Now, while they advocate, of course, almost a God-given right, they believe, to murder babies. And this was on display when Joe Biden commuted the sentences of, 25 or 27 federal prisoners who are currently, I guess they were on death row. They're not anymore. This country, I'm very convinced, will never turn around entirely until we purge the evil from our land. Now, this doesn't mean to kill everyone. That's not what I'm saying. It means that we legally enact the death penalty where it should apply, and we eliminate the woke mind virus from this country to the best of our ability by punishing the wicked, the lawbreakers, justly and swiftly. Now, one sad note about these cities of refuge is that if the Israelites actually followed God's laws and commands, they would have needed to add 3 more cities of refuge because of the additional land that God had promised them. But they didn't need to add any additional cities of refuge because they didn't obtain any additional land, because they chose to turn from God and do their own thing. And I gotta wonder, theoretically, how many blessings are we missing out on because we turn from God and do our own thing. Next, we see that boundaries and thus private property was actually important. You did not move a boundary marker because that was theft of private property. Now, this, along with other passages, should get rid of the idea that Christianity is some sort of a socialist religion. That's just ridiculous. We next read that if a witness lies about what the accused allegedly did, the false witness, as punishment, would receive the penalty they were seeking for the falsely accused. Now, that would probably take care of a large number of frivolous lawsuits, wouldn't it? I mean, there are some states with loser pay laws where the loser of the lawsuit has to cover the costs of both parties. That's getting closer. But look at all these racially motivated crimes perpetrated by someone of the same skin color, appears always to be of the darker shade, as those who the crime was allegedly committed against in order to try to demonize whitey or conservatives, because that's literally the only direction these fake crimes go. Or look at how many, typically women, accuse various men of sexual something that are then discovered to be nothing but lies. Look at how much money and time is spent, how many reputations are damaged, jobs and income are lost, and lives destroyed. If we had a system like Moses was speaking of, one would think a lot of that would go away, wouldn't one? This was stated as another way to purge the evil from among them. If the punishment would be a death penalty, well, the false witness, the liar, would receive that death penalty. And then guess who you don't have to worry about making a false accusation again? Yeah, that guy, but then how many others crawled back under their rocks due to the ripple effect? And again, we're told, do not show pity. There's a difference between justified mercy and pity. I mean, they were not to just ignore justice because they felt bad about it. If there was a legitimate path to show mercy, fine. But feelings were not to enter in, at least not like they do today. Moving into chapter 20, Moses exhorts the Israelites to not fear war. Remember Egypt, he said. The battle size, the discrepancy in sizes of armies, the region, none of that mattered. And why? Well, because they had Yahweh God on their side. To that end, before engaging in battle, the commanders were to go and thin out their ranks. Anyone who had built a new house but hadn't dedicated it yet could go home. Anyone who had planted a new vineyard but hadn't partaken of its produce yet could go home. Anyone newly engaged but not yet married could go home. And finally, simply anyone who was just too scared to go into battle could go back home. Now, this eliminated men who weren't focused on the task at hand. Battle, war, you need to be focused. And it further illustrated that Israel had the single most important warrior on their side, God. And we see this over and over again throughout the Old Testament, where God did something, some miracles, sometimes not, and won the battle for Israel. Now, after they had their standing army, the job wasn't quite done yet. The Israelites were to first offer peace. Now, this was generally speaking of the Israelites conquering a city, right? They would offer peace, which would require the citizens to become forced labor. That was the terms. If peace was not given or was not taken, I guess, then if the city was in the promised land, they were to kill all living things, everything that breathes. This is talking man, woman, child, animal. This helped to protect them from being pulled into the pagan cultures of those cities. But they were not to harm the trees, fruit or non-fruit, as those were there actually for the good of the Israelites to be used. If the city was far away, then all the males were to be killed, likely to avoid some sort of a future uprising, and all the females, children, animals, as well as all the treasures and the goods, all of that was declared to be plunder. Chapter 21 has some guidance for domestic relations, women from conquered cities becoming wives, etc., etc. We'll skip that. But at the end of chapter 21, we find what is to be done with a rebellious son. If parents are dealing with a rebellious son, they are to seize him, take him to the elders, explain what's going on, at which point the men of the city would stone him to death. Now, before you get all concerned, the parents were out there killing their little kids for not doing their chores or sassing their parents or something, and thus the Bible gave the okay to kill kids you didn't like. That wasn't the case at all. The Bible does say that this son was one who, even after discipline, will not listen to his parents. So it gives the possible appearance that this is a child. But when they take him to the elders, they are to tell them of the problems, with the examples being given of him being a glutton and a drunkard. That doesn't sound like a child so much anymore, now does it? This is an adult child, steeped in rebellion, unwilling to listen to his parents or to elders, someone that the rest of us would probably look at and shake our heads in disgust, as long as it wasn't our child. This command ends with Moses saying, quote, "Then all the men of his city shall stone him, and he will die. So you shall purge the evil from your midst, and all Israel will hear of it and fear." See, again, we see purging the evil. Mark Twain said, quote, "Everybody can serve as an example, if nothing else, a bad example." And that was what this adult rebellious son was to serve as, an example of what not to do for the rest of the Israelites. Now, this doesn't mean that the parents didn't love their son. It meant that they could see the rebellion for what it was, destructive. Parents today, me included, will profess that we will always love our children no matter what. And I have very little doubt that it was any different back then. But of course, we're not quite as harsh today as they were then. We'll come back to our current president here. Actually, as you listen to this, on the day it drops, our former president, right? Number 46, Joe, former president, an all-around joke of a human being, Biden, right? Yay. But look at his son, Hunter. This is a child who would have been stoned probably 20 years ago or more. But Joe coddled, made excuses for him. Then he used him in an inhumane way, if we're just being honest. Then he excused him some more and coddled him again. Now, many of us will simply cut the child off, right? If the rebellion is in college, well, the money dries up. If the rebellion is destructive, they're no longer allowed to come to the house, maybe. Some parents will cut them out of the will. Oftentimes, trust will be set up in the will to only allow the distribution of an inheritance if the child is meeting certain criteria, or more generally, they aren't in a state of rebellion. Now, these are all ways of attempting to accomplish what this command in Deuteronomy mandated. The difference between then and now, however, is that this rebellious child is today left to slowly destroy their own lives and potentially destroy the lives of others. Whereas in the Old Testament, well, the evil was purged from their midst. It sounds cold and cruel to our modern ears, but look at society today. And look at what happened only a few generations after Moses. When these commands were not upheld, everything kind of started falling apart, right? It may be hard, but something being hard to do doesn't make it wrong to do. Is everybody having a good time? Yes? No? Yes? Moving on, chapter 22 tells us that, yes, we are, in fact, our brother's keeper. So we're supposed to watch out for others. Okay? And then we read something interesting. Verse 5, quote, "A woman shall not wear man's clothing, nor shall a man put on woman's clothing, for whoever does these things is an abomination to Yahweh your God." This is dealing with cross-dressing, obviously, transvestitism or transgenderism. Now, let's pause here for a second. Let's be very clear here. There is no such thing as a transgender. It's not a thing that exists anywhere. Never has, never will be. Mark my words. Transgenderism is really just cross-dressing with a higher level of commitment, generally involving psychological, chemical, and anatomical mutilation. In order to transition a gender, scientists would have to literally crack open each and every cell in the body in order to modify both the chromosomes and the genetic code that creates the chromosomes. And I simply just don't see that ever happening. So transgenderism isn't a real thing. It's a fake word, like prehistoric, right? Nothing is prehistory. Everything in the past is simply history. Transgenderism is a term we need to get out of our lexicon. We don't need to allow others to use it as if it's a real thing. Anyway, this is where some will say, well, look, we don't follow other Old Testament laws anymore, so why is this one still in play? Well, there are a couple reasons. The simplest explanation is that this prohibition, the sinful nature of the sexual deviancy and this perversion is called out in both the Old and New Testament. Genesis 19 tells us about the sin of Sodom. And although, yes, Sodom sounds like it was an all-around wicked city, the main sin it's known for is homosexuality. Leviticus 18 tells us that it's an abomination for a man to lie with a man as he does a woman. And then 2 chapters later, we hear that if they do that, they're to be put to death. Moving into the New Testament, Romans 1 is probably the most well-known, speaking of the rebellion of humanity, women having relations with women, with the result being them receiving the due penalty for their sin in their bodies. Most would agree that this is likely speaking of STDs, AIDS, and others. And the even worse penalty, to be honest, of God giving them up to their sinful desires. Then we go to 1 Corinthians 6. It says that homosexuals, along with a laundry list of other examples of unrepentant sin, will not inherit the kingdom of God. And 1 Timothy 1 says homosexuals and others are contrary to the sound doctrine of God. And then, of course, we also have Jesus affirming in Matthew 19 the biblical account of Genesis and creation, saying that men and women were created in the beginning, and that's all, just those two, and that a man marries a woman. So the Bible repeats this prohibition, the sin and the penalty, multiple times, Old and New Testament. Now, the other reason, probably a larger topic, is the type of law we're talking about. There are 3 types of laws given in the Old Testament: ceremonial, moral, and judicial. The ceremonial laws were things like the feasts and festivals and sacrifices. These applied to the Israelites only. And then with the coming of Jesus and his adherence to all the laws perfectly, Christians today are not beholden to the ceremonial laws anymore. The judicial laws, again, these were essentially given for the Israelites. And there's a lot of them that we've talked about even just here in this segment today. And a lot of them we've been discussing over the last, year? Things to do with property, murder, rebellion, etc. To the Jew, this category would also generally encompass all of the moral laws, although we, Christians, would generally look at those as 2 different categories. So the judicial law is for a certain time and place, and for the Israelites. We, in America, or whatever country you're in, we have judicial laws as well. The United States starts with the Constitution, and it branches out from there. And then we have the moral law. The moral laws have to do with God's holy nature. This means that these don't change and they don't go away. They exist for as long as God exists and holds the office of God. Bottom line, I wouldn't recommend holding your breath on these going away anytime soon. These are laws that deal with things such as, and this is per God questions, quote, justice, respect, and sexual conduct, and includes the 10 Commandments. It also includes penalties for failure to obey the ordinances. Got Questions also points out that these laws are there for the welfare of all. They're obvious, and they're common sense laws, which, as the saying goes today, common sense ain't so common anymore. And most importantly, these don't point people to Christ, and they don't save you if you follow them perfectly, which you can't, at least nowhere near perfectly. They simply show us our depravity, how sinful, how fallen we are, and how much we need a Savior. This is why, in my opinion, the best way to witness to anyone, regardless of ethnicity, socioeconomic status, how good or bad their life is to bring them back to the 10 Commandments and show them how they're guilty of breaking all of them. That level sets everyone and shows the depravity of man and the need of a Savior. So, back to Deuteronomy 22:5, is cross-dressing still an abomination? Yes, it's a moral law regarding sexual perversion based on the holiness of God. It will never not be an abomination because God will never not be God. Continuing on, verses 6 and 7 give us another very odd command, much like the boiling of meat in the mother's milk. We're told, quote, if you happen to come upon a bird's nest along the way, in any tree or on the ground, with young ones or eggs, and the mother sitting on the young or on the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. You shall certainly let the mother go, but the young you may take for yourself, in order that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days. So what in the world does that mean? And why that little dangling promise at the end that it'll prolong your days? Seems important. Bottom line, after looking through a half a dozen different commentaries, nobody really knows. The most common comment on this is that it mandated some sort of humanity in the hearts of the Israelites. But I'm going to be honest here. Shoving the mother aside as you kidnap her born or unborn children so you can cook and eat them, that doesn't sound like the soft, squishy humanity most of these commentaries are trying to talk about. Some of the commentaries also get into a very legalistic look at this. If the mother bird is touching the nest, you let her go. But if she's not, you can take her too, or vice versa, something like that. I find it very unlikely that Moses, speaking for Yahweh, was playing a legalistic game of duck, duck, goose with the Israelites. My thought was that this is simply speaking of food. The mother bird is the creator of this food, much like cows or goats give milk, which makes cheese or butter, and they do this continually as long as they were first mothers, and then they're continuously milked. It would go well for us if we continued to allow the mother, providing food, to continue providing food. Same with birds. For us in the U.S., and probably most everywhere, think chickens. If we took the eggs that were laid, and we took the mother too, and cooked it all up together, it wouldn't go well for us in the long term because our source of food is now gone. I think this is simply a matter of sustainable food sources. Then, not to toot my own horn, but toot toot, I realized I hadn't opened my MacArthur Study Bible app to see if he had a comment. So I did. And he does. And he says the same thing. It's a food source. Now, of course, today we're told that eating meat is murder, and I don't know who said it, but I totally agree. Meat is murder. Tasty, tasty murder. So bottom line, we don't need to spiritualize everything just all of the time. We got to stop doing that. This one sounds to me like it was just a practical limitation in order to not do something stupid and destroy our food source. Okay, let's keep going. I'm working to a stopping point here. As we continue into the next few verses in chapter 22, we find more practical advice, which would help kind of bolster the point that not eating the mother bird is just practical advice. So when you build a house, build a parapet on the roof so you're not guilty of accidental murder. Basically, since their roofs were flat and often used as another room of the house, put a flipping railing around it, you fool. Don't sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed. You'll just screw everything up. Don't plow with an ox and a donkey together. You gotta believe that at this point, the eye rolls in the crowd were probably so great, it was likely audible. And then don't wear material mixed of wool and flax. And now, of course, the women in the crowd started rolling their eyes. I mean, who would be that stupid, they likely thought. And then make tassels on 4 corners of your garment. Now, this comes from Numbers 15 and has one purpose, to remind you, when you look at them, of the commandments of the Lord, so you do them. Then chapter 22 ends with some more statutes regarding sexual immorality. Kind of get the idea that this was an important topic. This deals with the virginity of a bride, the false or real claims by the new husband with regard to her virginity, and penalties if she isn't, penalties if he's lying because he decided he just didn't like her. A side note, if she's found to not be a virgin, she's brought to her father's house and stoned at his door because she has disgraced herself and played the harlot while under her father's roof, and quote, "Thus you shall purge the evil from among you." If the new husband was found to be a liar, he isn't stoned, but he does have to pay the father for what he tried to get away with, ruining reputations in the process, and he can never divorce her, which I'll be honest, that's going to be an awkward first few days or years to that brand new marriage. Moving on, if a man and woman are found committing adultery, okay, both of them are stoned. Quote, "Thus you shall purge the evil from Israel." If an engaged woman, a virgin, has sex with another man in the city and she didn't cry out because being in the city, someone would hear her cries for help, they're both stoned. Quote, "Thus you shall purge the evil from among you." If this was done outside the city where nobody could hear her cry out, well, then the man is stoned. If a man lies with a woman, a virgin, who is not engaged, the man must pay the bride price. They are now to be married and can never divorce. Now, this sounds as if the woman is forced to marry her rapist. But again, when you tie these things together, these two people were discovered doing this. Obviously, she had not and was not crying out, which meant that she was a willing participant. So honestly, this is a merciful act, since they could technically both be stoned for sexual immorality. Okay, finally moving into chapter 23. It's a lot of rules as to who can and can't come into the assembly, who's clean, who isn't. This all speaks to the holiness of God. There are some restrictions that you or I would likely balk at because, look, it's an injury or it's a birth defect. That's not the person's fault. Why wouldn't God allow them to come into the assembly? Doesn't God love us in our imperfections? Yeah, no, not really. No, he doesn't. No, see, God loves the Son. He loves Jesus. Imperfection is not allowed in God's presence. Jesus, the Son, and for that matter, the Holy Spirit, can come in contact with sinful humanity, imperfect humanity, but God the Father cannot. So those who are imperfect are not allowed to come into the assembly of God. Now, as a born-again, redeemed Christian, this is where the principle of double imputation comes in. Imputing something is just basically giving something to someone else. Upon salvation, we impute or give our sins, our sinful nature, to Jesus, who pays or paid for those on the cross. Then Jesus imputes or gives to us his righteousness. Some have described it as Jesus placing his cloak of righteousness around us, which makes us righteous and perfect in the eyes of God. When he looks at us, he sees the Son. That makes us able to come into the assembly of God because of what Jesus did and who Jesus is, nothing to do with us. Then the end of chapter 23. There's some really good advice here. If you make a vow to God, do it. Don't delay, do it right away. If you vow to God and you don't do it, it's sin. Then Moses gives some even better advice. Quote, however, if you refrain from vowing, it will not be a sin in you. That kind of comes back to letting your yes be yes and your no be no. There's almost no need to make vows in this life. There's only a few situations that require actual vows, marriage being one of them. So be careful, little mouth, what you say, right? My advice is to not make flippant promises. And you know they're flippant if you have to throw in a bunch of caveats. Oh, I promise we'll go to the park as long as I get done at work on time and I don't get caught in traffic. I don't decide to do something else. Why are you promising this? Just say, look, we can go to the park after I get home, but I'm not sure what the day will bring. So right now, let's plan on it, and we'll try our best to get there. Some will just abbreviate that to God willing. We're going to go to the park this afternoon, God willing. Right? Okay. It's a longer segment, I get it. Just trying to move through this a little faster than we have been. Hopefully, as always, you found at least something interesting or thought-provoking. All right. Although we moved into 2025, nothing has changed. As always, let me know what you think. Give me your feedback. Ask questions. Tell me what you're learning. Now, get up, get off your duff, and go be a Berean. Well, we've reached the end of this episode of the Logical Christian Podcast. I know, I'm not happy about it either. If you found value in this podcast, like, rate, review, and share if you wouldn't mind. Don't forget to check the show notes for links and contact info. Against logic, there is no armor like ignorance. Lawrence J. Peter. If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Jesus. So stay in the word, stay logical, stay faithful, and until next time, God bless.